Hello. Good morning, everybody. I think we are online, and welcome to this webinar series for parliamentarians. I'm so happy. My name is Rosa Galvez, independent senator at Canadian Parliament, representing Quebec province. So let me start by talking about the our network. So in 2021 at COP 26 in Glasgow, 19 parliamentarians from 10 different countries launched the Parliamentarians' Call for a Fossil Fuel-Free Future. The call aims to encourage other parliamentarians and global leaders to work together to accelerate a full, fast, fair, funded phase out of coal, oil, and gas in order to keep within the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. A year later, in COP27, 500 parliamentarians from 70 countries supported the call. At first, Global Assembly of this parliamentary initiative, also during COP27, was decided to take the leap from being an initiative to a whole global network. In order to harness the voice and influence of parliamentarians, the first project of the network was initiated. It was called the Global Parliamentarians Inquiry into the Progress of Fossil Fuel Phase-Out. The inquiry was conducted by a committee composed of 16 parliamentarians from 16 different countries. In less than 1 year, the committee held 4 public hearings, delved into 4 main topics, and is preparing a full report to be released at COP29. A preliminary version was released and formally submitted to the global stock take during COP28. Apart from the global inquiry, the network has also conducted 2 national initiatives inquiry in Mexico and Colombia, and is preparing a new global effort to initiate and address the Amazon region. Today, there are more than 800 parliamentarians from 95 countries in the network, but more voices are needed from around the world. This series of webinars is a new channel, a new means to keep working among parliamentarians globally. These webinars are the opportunity, or give the opportunity, to share knowledge, but also experiences on key topics, such as the one touching today, climate finances, but also in connection with renewable energy and just transition. So what can we say about climate finance? Climate finance is an essential and key element of the global effort to combat planet warming. Let me tell you some good reasons of interest to you, my colleagues parliamentarians. Climate finance provides the necessary resources for projects and technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This includes investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable transportation. Developing countries and vulnerable communities often lack the resources to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change, such as rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and changing to sustainable agricultural practice. Climate finance should help these regions build resilience by funding infrastructure improvement, disaster preparedness, and sustainable agricultural practices. Also, we need finance to facilitate the transfer of clean technologies from developed to developing countries. This transfer is essential for enabling global access to low carbon technologies and practices. Effective climate action requires strong institutions, skilled personnel, and robust system for monitoring and reporting. Climate finance can support capacity building initiatives. Public finance can help to leverage private investment by reducing risk and providing incentive for private sector participation. This can significantly increase the total amount of resources available for climate action. Finally, climate finance is also a critical component of international climate agreements, such as the Paris Agreement. Developed countries have committed mobilizing financial resources to assist developing countries in their climate efforts. Meeting these commitments is essential for maintaining trust and cooperation in global climate governance. So what are the objectives of this webinar? We want to discuss best practices and legislative strategies to enhance, facilitate climate finance at the national level. We want to encourage dialogue and collaboration among us parliamentarians from different countries and share experiences, challenges, and solutions in mobilizing and managing climate finance. And we want to equip parliamentarians with the knowledge and the tools needed for increased climate finance and ensure its effective use in the respective country. So with all of that, well, let me wish you a productive event and let's start. So we have a full plan and we will start with Yolando Velasco. Let me talk to you about Yolando. So Yolando Velasco is presently managing the Climate Finance Subdivision of the Secretariat of the United Nations Climate Change Convention based in Bonn, Germany. He is also leading the Interim Secretariat of the Loss and Damage Fund. He has 32 years of experience in national and international climate policy development, managing climate-related projects, and the intergovernmental process on climate finance. So I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting talk. Can we give the floor to Yolando?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Rosa. And can you hear me well?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks. And again, a pleasure and thank you to the Parliamentarians for Fossil-Free Future for inviting me. And indeed, having climate finance as a topic for your discussion is also timely, because COP29 is envisioned to be a COP on climate finance, and I'm going to explain that later. But for now, I'll provide you an overview of the intergovernmental process on climate finance, meaning the negotiations on climate finance under the UNFCCC. And next slide, please. And leading towards an understanding of what are the expected outcomes on climate finance at COP29. But before that, it's important to understand climate finance in the context of the financial mechanism that was established under the convention in 1992. And these are just basically some of the key highlights of the Article 11 of the convention. One is that the operating entity or entities, meaning institutions that will be established, funds that will be established by the Conference of Parties, including the treaties that will be established by the convention. These funds functions under the guidance and accountable to the Conference of Parties. So that's one. Second, again, as I mentioned, one or more operating entities. There are currently about 3 of them under the financial mechanism, and of course, one is under the Kyoto Protocol, which is the Adaptation Fund, which will soon move towards the Paris Agreement. And then the third one is ensure that there is predictable finance to implement the convention and the Paris Agreement. And in terms of channels, you have bilateral, regional, and other multilateral channels. The same financial mechanism of the convention also serves the Paris Agreement. Thus, the institutions that fall under the financial mechanism of the convention are the same institutions that serve the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. Just to compare the provisions of the convention and the provisions under the Paris Agreement in terms of, for example, who who are responsible in terms of providing resources. So under the convention, you have the developed countries taking the lead, or not taking the lead, but has a commitment to deliver resources to developing countries. Whereas under the Paris Agreement, you have developed countries taking the lead and other parties. The term other parties refer to other developing countries that are in a position to do so, are encouraged to provide resources on a voluntary basis. So the voluntary basis here is for the other parties. For developed countries, they are still committed to take the lead in provision of resources. Second is that in the context of the convention, you have again, I mentioned earlier, predictability of resources, adequacy, etc. This is just to ensure that when developing countries come up with their plans, be it NAPs or NDCs, that they are assured that resources are available. And that's why most of the NDCs by developing countries are conditioned on the availability of international resources being provided. Whereas for the Paris Agreement, you have the continuation of the 100 billion being affirmed. Although the timeline, it's supposed to be from 2020 onwards, but then the parties agreed that to conclude on it in 2025. And that's why we have the new collective quantified goal being negotiated and to be concluded at COP29 in Baku to replace the 100 billion. And I'm going to discuss further on that. And finally, provision of financial resources in terms of instruments. So the convention, you have a grant or concessional basis. Earlier, Rosa mentioned about equities and other types of instruments, which are of course available and in the context of the Paris Agreement. So the instruments as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned on finance has opened up. Even the sources of finance where, for example, in the context of the convention, it's mainly public finance. And as a matter of fact, the discussion on the role of the private sector only started in 2007, leading towards the Copenhagen / Cancun agreement that led to the 100 billion commitment. And the 100 billion commitment provided for all sources of finance, public, private, and alternative sources. Next slide, please. Earlier, Rosa also mentioned about the types of activities being covered by the financial mechanism. From the convention side, you have the obligations of parties to prepare reports, so national communications and other reporting obligations by developing countries were supported by the financial mechanism on a full cost basis. And then you have mitigation and adaptation on full incremental costs. So these are basically just the scope of type of activities being funded under the convention. Whereas under the Paris Agreement, of course, in addition to mitigation adaptation, you would have the loss and damage, you have the forests, you have technology, capacity building, and awareness, education were also covered under the convention, but the new ones are the forest and the loss and damage. type of activities. So that's basically an overview of the provisions under the convention, which is Article 11, and then you would have Article 9 under the Paris Agreement. Now going into an understanding of the architecture of climate finance. Next slide, please. Again, this is, can you, sorry, yes, can you, yeah, the whole, yeah. Oh no, yes. So just to understand how, at least from the Secretariat side, and how the parties looked into the different elements or pillars of climate finance and how they are linked. So you would have one is the top one is the mobilization of finance, and currently parties, of course, and the intergovernmental process is looking into 100 billion. But then we're now transitioning to post-2025 new collective and quantified goal on finance, to which it's expected that the new goal will be beyond and higher than the 100 billion. 100 billion is used as the basis or a baseline for the NCQG. And then under Article 9.5 of the Paris Agreement, there is a provision there where developed countries provide information on projected finance every 2 years. So again, this is in the context of predictability and adequacy of resources. So developed countries provide that information, and under Article 9.7 later on, they provide information on finance mobilized and provided, so that then parties are able to compare the 9.5, which is the projected finance, and 9.7, which was actually how much of that has been delivered. And this is again in the context of you would have the oversight function of the Conference of Parties, where currently from the MRVIV support, we now have the enhanced transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. And starting end of this year, the developing countries, as a matter of fact, will be reporting on under Article 13 of the Paris Agreement on the needs, so support needed in terms of finance, technology, and capacity building, and support received. So it's not just both the needs and also the actual support received by developing countries. On the side of the developed countries, they're supposed to provide information on support provided and mobilized for the developing countries. So that then we would be able to, or the convention process would be able to compare what was actually needed, what was promised, and what was actually delivered on the ground. Up until now, there's no way of determining that. And then finally, we have the delivery mechanisms. You have under the financial mechanism, the operating entities, we have the Green Climate Fund, we have the Global Environment Facility, and then the latest one, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. We have special funds established under the GEF. You have there the LDC fund, and also the Special Climate Change Fund. The Special Climate Change Fund provides resources or funds adaptation type of projects. In the context of the GEF Trust Fund, that one only covers mitigation. And that's why these special funds were established. to cover other activities, including adaptation. And then in addition, as I mentioned, we have the Adaptation Fund established under the Kyoto Protocol to be financed by the share of proceeds generated by the CDM. And now under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the carbon markets, the share of proceeds that will be generated under Article 6 will also go to support adaptation fund. And in addition to these, we have other public finance institutions, you have bilateral, regional, multilateral channels. So that's basically just an overview of the finance architecture and the deliberation by parties annually during the COP evolves around these three sets of elements or pillars around the architecture. And for example, later on, I'm going to present the agenda at COP29. That agenda, the different agenda items would be linked to one, if not two, or the whole of this architecture, including the NCQG. Next slide, please. So for the last 3 years, the parties have been preparing for this year, COP29, to come up with what they call the new collective quantified goal on finance, aimed at replacing the 100 billion. And the whole idea of this NCQG is to enable ambitious actions by developing countries, be it in the context of the NDC, be it in the context of adaptation. Currently, the issue of loss and damage, whether it will be included in the NCQG or not, is still being debated. But indeed, that's one of the scope of the NCQG, depending on the outcomes of the negotiations. So for the last 2 years, up until last year, since Glasgow, the parties engaged in what we call the technical expert dialogues to explore the different aspects and facets of climate finance, from public to private, issues around access, issues around determining the quantum, issues around the qualitative aspects of climate finance, the delivery channels, effectiveness of finance, looking into the different sectors and subsectors, or what they call the thematic scope of NCQG, looking into the timelines and timeframes of the NCQG, and finally also looking into the transparency. So the last 2 years were dedicated in more of a technical discussion. This year, it's a mix of technical discussion and a political process, starting with what we call the ad hoc working group meetings. These meetings are aimed at parties starting to frame the draft decision text. Given that that the COP is only 2 weeks, there may not be enough time to conclude on a decision if all of these will only be worked out during the COP. And that's why this year, 3 sessions are dedicated to prepare the draft. So the first one was in Cartagena in April. The last one was in June here in Bonn. And the last session will take place in Azerbaijan in September. And basically, the aim is to narrow down the options so that then it would be more, it would be, the one is that the political options are identified so that then ministers can engage on those political issues. At the same time, the technical options are filtered and so that then the draft text will be more manageable. So in terms of the structure of the decision, and based on the inputs received and discussed so far by parties, the inputs are around the preamble, like for example, the principles in the convention, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities are there. Issues around context would be around poverty alleviation, sustainable development, etc. So including what would be the basis for determining the quantum itself. Like, for example, temperature or based on the needs of developing countries, etc., or the evolving condition of the economies. So these are some of the inputs getting into the preamble and the context. Now getting into the heart of the decision itself is the quantum. You have the quantitative elements and you have the qualitative elements. So the quantitative elements are obviously highly debated because you have a range of, if you look into the needs determination report of the Standing Committee on Finance, based on all the reports produced by the developing countries, be it NDCs, national communications, adaptation communication, technology needs assessment, etc., etc. The range of needs would be from 1.1 trillion to about 4 trillion, depending again on what are the parameters and that are being looked into. You would have you also in the context of, so that's from the needs determination report of the SEF, to which developing countries are saying that we should use the needs as the basis for determining the quantum. But at the same time, we also have the top-down numbers coming from UNEP, GAP report. You have from IRENA, from IPCC, you have from IEA and others that looked into mitigation, adaptation needs. And then, of course, parties themselves are able to generate the numbers. Like, for example, the current proposals on the table ranges from 1.1 trillion, mainly public finance, to about 2 trillion if you include all sources, meaning private and domestic sources. So again, that's one of the debate, and that's one of the negotiations. And then you have the qualitative elements, again, as I mentioned, access to finance, the delivery mechanism, the enabling environments, policies that need to be in place in order to incentivize investments. And you have the thematic scope, the mitigation, adaptation, and as I said, the loss and damage is a question mark. And then also a debate on whether the NCQG will just focus on the large number or the main sector, or they go into subsectors like energy efficiency, renewable energy targets, etc. Because in Dubai, parties already agreed to the doubling and tripling of these subsectors anyway. And then finally, the transparency arrangements, which currently the proposal is to use the same arrangements, transparency arrangements under the Paris Agreement, Article 13. And there seems to be some consensus around that. So instead of creating a new one, just use the current one, adjust it if needed, to be able to suit the need of the NCQG. Next slide, please. So these are basically between now and COP29. I mentioned about technical work of the technical expert dialogues of the NCQG, but then in addition, there are other processes, technical work being undertaken, like for example, the Article 21C, which is the ensuring that finance flows are consistent with low emission and climate resilient development. So basically, Article 21C looks at financing or ensuring that the finance flows or investments outside of the intergovernmental process, outside of the convention, are consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And there is a parallel process that looks into this. That's what we call the Sharm el-Sheikh Dialogue on Article 21C. Also looking into the Article 9 of the Paris Agreement. The reason for the link between Article 21C is that 21C is viewed as mainly the private sector, the broader finance flows. And then Article 9 is viewed as mainly the public finance flows. And that's why both are being looked at in the context of the NCQG and in the context of the discussion on climate finance. And then we also have the reports of the Standing Committee on Finance. The Standing Committee on Finance is the advisory body of the Conference of the Parties and also the CMA, the Paris Agreement. And this year, the SCF will be once again providing, presenting its report on the biennial assessment of global finance flows, looking into both public, the private, and other sources of finance. They will be presenting a report on the needs determination report, the needs of the developing countries. This is the second report that they're preparing, which comes every 4 years. And then they also have a report on defining climate finance, which again is an issue in terms of the 100 billion, in terms of determining the goal. And then you have the ongoing work by the current president, COP28 president, and the incoming presidency in terms of both bilateral and multilateral processes to discuss the political issues on NCQG. And then we expect that at COP29, there will be 2 high-level ministerial dialogues. The high-level ministerial dialogue on NCQG will take place in conjunction with the pre-COP in Baku in October, which is expected to discuss the political issues. And key political issues on NCQG currently is around the quantum, determining that number, which is linked also to the contributor base. So who will contribute to the NCQG? And of course, there is this issue around developed countries and other parties. And then you have there the rest of the issues that I've mentioned earlier in terms of the scale, sources, delivery, access, instruments, governance, transparency. One thing to note that the NCQG this year will be basically coming up with a framework of the long-term goal. So the implementation of this will still need to be figured out and worked out by parties come in the upcoming coming COPs, and that's something to, and in the context of the parliamentarians, this would be critical, because we may have the goal, but then if we don't have the implementing measures to do that, then it will retain as a goal, and that's why one of the deliberation or the discussion is around the enabling environments, the policies that are needed to implement this, and how it gets translated at the national level. And that's something that needs to be looked at again in the upcoming COP, both at the international and also at the domestic level. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all the agenda items, but just to give you a sense of the agenda items on finance at COP. This is a mix of you have the long-term finance, which is about the 100 billion, and you know that the developed country parties or OECD this year prepared a report saying that in 2022 the 100 billion has been met. The developed countries delivered about 115 billion in 2022. And of course, the debate there is that what about the gap in 2020 and 2021, which is about 27 billion. So these are mostly at the political level discussion. But then it has also implication in terms of the NCQG, because the 100 billion is used as the basis for the NCQG. So if it has not been delivered in those years, and the question is, will it be delivered in the upcoming years up until 2025? It takes another 2 years to be able to determine whether, you know, for example, for 2023 and 2024, we will only find out the data in 2026. So there's a 2-year gap before we are able, or at least the OECD and others are able to gather all the information for that particular year. You have the guidance to the operating entities, the GCF, the GEF, where parties provide the guidance on their priorities, etc. And then you have the reviews. But then next slide, please. The key elements or key issues that makes actually this COP a finance COP would be around the NCQG. So that's one. Second is the loss and damage fund and the funding arrangement, which is basically this would be the first time that the fund for responding to loss and damage, the board will be preparing its report to the COP and the CMA. And in that report, the board will either confirm or not confirm that they have concluded the legal arrangements with the World Bank that will serve as the Secretariat and trustee to the fund. So that would be critical for that. The board has already approved the Philippines as its host. The next step now is to conclude on that arrangement with the Philippines also, and both will be reported to the COP and the CMA. In addition to the fund itself, the loss and damage fund, there will also be a high-level dialogue to look into the broader sources of finance for loss and damage. And then the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue I mentioned to you earlier on Article 21C, which is critical in terms of mobilizing bigger scale of resources, larger than of course, what the public finance can mobilize. And then we have the other finance issues around 100 billion. And then, of course, we have the high-level ministerial dialogue. And also an agenda item to discuss on the status of the commitment by developed countries to double adaptation finance from 20 billion in 2019 to about 40 billion in 2025. So these are all part of the discussions at COP29, and I end here my presentation just in case. And if you have questions or comment, happy to discuss. Over to you, Rosa. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yolando. Thank you so much. This is so fantastic to have a clear picture of what's going on with the United Nations Organization of the Climate Finance. I have questions, but I'm going to invite the participants to maybe write in the chat some questions, or unless Denise or Dinah have other ways or other means, if somebody can raise a hand, I don't know. But I will start with some questions. For somebody that it's not inside the United Nations technocracy and the organization, this is very complex. And there is a lot of acronyms, which, you have to be there every year to understand and retain those names. But in general, I think as parliamentarians, we have some basic questions. Like, for example, you said that for the 2022, the nations have come and they have delivered with what was promised, but past years we have a gap there that needs to be solved. But my question is, so is these funds or part of these funds already being delivered by one of the three mechanisms that you have listed, the green climate funds, the global environmental, the funds loss and damage? Have they been already delivered to specific countries? And do we have information on the success or challenges of this funding?
Thanks for asking that question, Rosa. But and indeed, finance is is a complex one, because they have finance that is being pledged, finance that is being committed, and finance that is being disbursed. So these are three different terms. So, for example, the ones that 122 billion that is being committed to different sources, be it bilateral or multilateral, including the funds. So the funds under the convention, the GCF, GEF, well, we have the 600 million from loss and damage from Dubai, but that's not counted, because this 115 billion was in 2022. And then of course you have the adaptation fund. This basically, and if you include the climate investment fund, which is outside of the convention, was established under the World Bank. All of this is about 10% of the total public finance. The rest are actually being delivered through bilateral and multilateral institutions like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and others. So those are the resources being committed to that. The question now is that those resources that are being committed meaning those countries have signed the commitment agreements with these institutions or have allocated resources, for example, for their bilateral institutions, doesn't mean that those resources have already been used and have been actually delivered, because they have like either a 2-year or 3-year. In the case of GCF, it's a 4-year replenishment. So then what is committed by a particular country to the GCF, even signed, can actually take about 4 years for that to be actually delivered to the funds itself. The next question is from once the fund receive these resources, then they have to go through all the project approval processes, agreements, and etc., and then the disbursement. And even the disbursement is not actually also in a timely manner. So what we are, in short, what we are, or what OECD and others are counting right now are from the source side and not from the recipient side. Article 13, the one I mentioned earlier, may actually provide us that information, and that's why this is important for the parliamentarians who is in charge with the national budget and the public finance institutions at the national level, who will be preparing these reports, may actually be able to look into this information. Because, like, for example, as I said, developing countries will provide information on the support needed and support received. So received meaning those are actual resources that has been disbursed and they've received. So we may be able to at least fine tune this information hopefully from end of this year onwards.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. So I have a question from Alvin Padilla from Philippines. He says, well, thank you so much for the great input. What is the difference in terms of roles and responsibilities between the Philippines and the World Bank as host?
Okay. So the Philippines is host to the board of the fund. Because the board will need legal capacity and legal personality to be able to sign agreement with the bank. So treat it as two separate institutions. So you would have the board having its own legal personality, and the bank will be serving the board, and that's why they need to get into these legal arrangements. So, and there are two functions of the bank. One is secretariat to the board, and then the other one is the trustee to the fund, basically managing the trust fund. So when the Philippines when the board approved, selected the Philippines as its host, it is only hosting the board, giving the board legal personality and capacity. But the whole operations of the fund will still be with the World Bank, both the Secretariat and the Trust Fund.
Okay, thank you. Waiting for, yeah, he's saying thank you so much. I have another question. So you were saying that we need to see that translation of this funding into policies at the national level, and you are recommending that parliamentarians that sit in, how important is for parliamentarians to sit and to follow what is going on the national budgets, on the national finances, no? And this is very important. So much for the parliamentarians in the developed countries, which are contributing to the funds, and so much for the parliamentarians in the developing countries affected by the extreme weather events. Both are so important. So it happens that I sit in the National Finance Committee in Canada, and I see when we are our commitments, you know, and of course we are in delay, and there are so many things. But let me tell you something that some of my colleagues parliamentarians think. They think that some of the damage and loss and damage funds will come back to Canada because we are having so much extreme weather events, you know? So we need to raise awareness on who's doing what as a priority. And tell me if you agree or not, but in general, my perspective is that while the developed countries have very high emissions and they need to focus on mitigation, because at the local level, they have funds to for adaptation. When I look into the developing countries, is adaptation, which is so much important. And then is this questioning about for the mitigation, how important for them is the mitigation, because they have to develop. And of course, they cannot do the same mistake as the developed countries with it. You know, we are still sometimes with coal and gas and very far from phasing out fossil fuels. But do you have a comment with respect to that?
I'll separate my personal opinion from my role in the UNFCCC, and of course we looked at this from the UN side, and of course from the personal side. But this time it's more from looking at it from the UNFCCC being facilitator and support. I think it's important, and that's why this reporting of information is critical, because it guides the policy making both at the international and at the domestic level. Like for example, some countries, including the Philippines and some of the ASEAN countries, and I understand that UNDP is also helping some African countries to do climate budget tagging. Which is important. It's a policy tool for the country to understand how much are we really spending on climate. And now with the increasing impact of climate, are we getting more from the international, or are we spending more from our domestic budget? That's one. Second, it's also important to understand what are other development needs that are being sacrificed because of resources being shifted to climate. Of course, most of the climate finance have development nexus or links to development, but not all. So, for example, if a country X is experiencing in the past 10 super typhoons or extreme events, and now they're experiencing 20, then that means that what they budgeted for 10 will have to increase to 20. But then what about education? What about health? What about other means? And this is something that that is actually critical in understanding the expenditures for climate. Not just to understand how much efforts are being done by the country on climate, but also in terms of again as a policy tool. for the LDCs, it's even critical, and that's why instruments are also important. Are they accessing mostly grants or mostly loans? And it so happened that unfortunately, most of the developing countries and even LDCs and even the fragile and conflict affected area states where they're getting or they are being offered more of loans than grants. And the type of activities are mostly mitigation rather than adaptation. So these are things that are important in terms of policy making. And that's why, for example, some countries intentionally are saying that we will only accept adaptation type of international support and no longer mitigation. So they start to reprioritize their access to international finance, especially if it is a loan or even concessional, regular loan or concessional finance. So yeah, so those are just facts and situation that's happening right now, at least on finance with regards to developing countries.
Thank you so much. Yes, I agree with you with your opinions, we have to have a whole government approach, and we have to try to be efficient in addressing the multiple crises. And because we cannot put the funds only to one specific objective, it have to, unfortunately, that's where we are. We need to solve many things, and actually a lot of things will be facilitated if we invest more in education, and if we invest more in addressing health and inequality issues that will solve at the end also the pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions problem. So thank you so much. There is a last question from a participant. What does hosting the Loss and Damage Board and Fund mean for the Philippines?
I think I already explained that earlier. So basically just giving the board the legal personality and legal capacity to be able to sign contract or agreement with the World Bank. So that's well, that's the most direct implication. But the other implication would be the meetings of the board. They have not decided yet, but at least most of the meetings of the board will take place in the Philippines, where they will be covered with the privileges and immunities. They have all these agreements, host country agreement with the country. So, but yeah, those are in terms of the implications of that.
Thank you so much, Yolando, Velasco. This was very interesting and very pertinent talk to our work as parliamentarians. I thank you so much. Hopefully we'll see you eventually somewhere in one of the COP meetings. Thank you so much. I don't know where you are based. You say you're based in Bonn, in Germany?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for the invitation.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. So proceeding with our webinar, we have now second panelist, the Honorable Lawrence Biyika Songa, my friend. He's a member of the Parliament of Uganda and the chairperson of the Committee and Forum on Climate Change. He served as the deputy chairperson of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee and a member of the Committees of Science, Technology and Innovation, Rules, Privilege and Discipline, ICT, and National Guidance. He is associated with the Global Renewable Congress, Climate Parliament, International Renewable Energy Agency, Forum on Small Arms and Light Weapons, Nilo-Saharan Learning Center, Green Alternative and Peace Movement, Formosa Club, and Sons Community Foundation. So thank you so much, Honorable Biyika Songa. Unfortunately, Lidi Nakpil, the parliamentarians, Lidi Nakpil has told us that for health reasons she cannot join us. So we are going to Lawrence. or unless I'm mistaken. Yes, you're
thank
there.
You.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, my apology because I'm just joining it late because of some challenges, but I'm very happy that I'm here now. On the issue of climate finance, especially in relation to Africa, I think I have the following to really present. One, climate finance is really very important for Africa in order to address the climate challenges that are facing Africa. That is a very key point. But however, the financing of climate issues in Africa is having a lot of challenges, and I will focus on that. One, we know that with the climate financing, we would be able to address, for example, fossil fuel phase out, maybe renewable energy transition, just transition, and so on. But Africa is having challenge of accessing these funds, and also the bureaucracy in accessing these funds, even generating those proposals is still a challenge. But what we need to do as a continent or countries in the least developed countries, we need to mobilize the funds, yes. We need to develop policy framework. We need to build capacity of stakeholders. We also need innovation, especially technical, so that we can have some technologies that can be used to address climate change in Africa. But also, it is important that if we have that fund, it will be help us in developing climate resilience. Most communities in Africa are prone to climate change. Although Africa's contribution to the climate change challenges, like especially the greenhouse gas emission, is only 4%, but the impact on Africa is really so much. So with climate financing, we'll be able to really address some of those challenges. Now, Africa faces a lot of gap. For example, for us to address all our NDCs, if you combine the NDCs in Africa and you see how much it would cost, the financial gap, the financing gap is about $2.8 trillion. And we needed to raise this money between 2020 to 2030. But now we are just few years to 2030, and we have not raised even I can say a quarter of that money. Then number two, there is also slow progress. With the little money we want to access, for example, from Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund, or other funds, there is slow progress because of delays. I talked about bureaucracy before. There are a lot of delays, and also accessing it is very, very hard. In most African countries, this funding has to come through a third party. And in most cases, what reaches the ground is very minute percentage of that money approved, for example, from the funders, like a Green Climate Fund, Adaptation Fund, or other funds. Now, another problem is the issue of no private sector engagement. This is in two ways, because we would really expect private sector bodies to be in position to invest heavily in maybe renewable energy technologies and investment. But in most cases, private sector bodies, whether in Africa or from outside that are interested in investing in Africa, they face another challenge of credit rating because they have to go for loans. They have to go for loans. But in most cases, African countries are rated low in terms of repayment of that loan. So in most cases, even funding put to address climate change, it ends, like for example, renewable energy ends up in the developed world because they are rated higher. In Africa, you only find some few countries like Tunisia, Botswana, Mauritius that are able to access some funding. But most African countries are rated below average, that no banks can give a loan to a private sector to invest in Africa. That had been a big challenge. And yet politically, there is political will where most African governments really want the investments to take place in Africa. For example, if you want to promote solar energy, most African countries import solar from China, solar panels from China and Germany. Now, most African governments are saying, why can't those companies come and invest in Africa so that we cut off, first of all, the resources, the minerals to make some of these panels and so on, the batteries, the battery materials are already readily available in Africa, and you would access them at really limited cost. And then at the same time, this would create jobs for Africa and reduce conflicts, which are disrupting other SDGs in Africa. So most African governments are having that will of companies coming from outside of or within Africa to invest in Africa. And also to import a solar panel from China to Africa, about 7,000 miles away, or from Germany, it is coming with a lot of emissions again. So it watered down even the efforts we are putting on the ground if we had the manufacturing in Africa. Then another challenge is the low capacity. At the moment, there is limited capacity. We still need capacity in preparing concept notes and proposals and so on. That is another area where we need to really address heavily. But the issue of credit rating must be addressed, because minus that, most private sector organizations are not going to access this climate financing. And so the solutions we need, one is to really focus on our NDCs and tag the money to the NDCs. Another issue is we need to diversify our sources. We should not only rely on global funds like Green Climate Fund. Africans or the least developed countries also need to diversify some alternative sources of funding. For example, we have a lot of minerals in Africa. If these minerals are got in a sustainable manner, in an environmentally friendly manner, they will be able to fund all these renewable energy technologies. So we need to diversify our sources of income. And then we need to strengthen capacity building. And then most of these initiatives are not Africa-led or LDC-led. That is also a challenge. So most Africans think that these are foreign ideas. So we need to involve also African people or leaders or technical people in some of these initiatives so that they are able to address. And then Parliament, of course, based on the roles of Parliament, Parliament will also play a very crucial role in making the policy, the legislation, the budget issue, the oversight and accountability of these monies that African governments are accessing, but also representing the views of the people who are the vulnerable people, smallholder farmers who are suffering the vulnerability of climate change. The advocacy will be done by parliamentarians. And then another issue is they will also help to support capacity building, and then also bringing out stakeholder engagement, but also international cooperation, like we are cooperating on fossil fuel phase out. This is a very important area where members of parliament will be able to promote that kind of international cooperation, but also monitoring and evaluation of some of these initiatives will be very important. Coordination of the various government ministries, stakeholders, civil society, government, academia, and private sector. That is the role we, as members of parliament, will play in addressing some of these issues relating to climate financing and climate change. And finally, the issue of awareness raising, because people still trust their members of parliament and they are interacting with the issues on the ground on day-to-day basis. So we think that if some of these issues can be addressed, and then we can create a dialogue where we can find workable solutions. Most African governments do not want this money to come through a third party because little reaches the ground. We want this money to come through the designated entity so that it can go on the ground. But again, the challenge, we need also to address the issue of corruption at all levels, because that is also very, very, very important. And then we need to address the issue of conflict, because you may invest heavily in climate financing in countries, but you will find that local conflict will interrupt the implementation of that initiative, especially countries that have a lot of minerals like the Democratic Republic of Congo, maybe Central African Republic, South Sudan, and so on, Somalia. So even if you give that money, sometimes it is interrupted. The implementation of the ground is interrupted. And most of this conflict, or companies that are causing this conflict, again, are coming from outside Africa. That's why international cooperation is very important. Collaboration and dialogue with entities in the north is also very important. And finally, which is also very important, is the issue of when we talk about things like carbon credit. The price they are giving in Africa is very low. In Uganda, it is $12 per ton of carbon dioxide avoided, or for the carbon sink, the value of our carbon sink. Now, we think that this is a product which is acceptable globally. Even the United States, for example, they are taking a ton at $100, or in Europe, in European Union at 100 euro. Why is it that in Africa it is only $12? That discourages the smallholder farmers who have limited land, and they want to sacrifice some of their land, maybe to plant trees to become carbon sinks. But also we have carbon sinks in the national parks and protected areas, which are not yet valued. That's why we still need capacity building, so that we can we can give value to, we can measure the value of our carbon sink, and then negotiate a good price. Again, that one needs us to negotiate at the international level, so that this international cooperation is very important. So I think for climate financing, these are the issues around climate financing in Africa and the challenges. I thank you.
Lawrence, that was great. Thank you so much. You have wise words, and you have an understanding of what's going on, and specifically in your continent and in your region. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I will do my presentation, and then we can stay, both of us, for questions, if you don't mind. Is that okay with you?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
perfect.
I'm okay.
Okay, so let me share my my screen and go ahead with my presentation. And okay, so I think most of you know me. I just want to say that as a background, I am a civil engineer with a specialty in environmental engineering, and I have been a professor for 30 years of my life, and I am at my 9th year as an independent senator, which I mentioned it before. So I want to start by talking about the economy, because the economy has gone developing almost by itself, and without people and professionals and parliamentarians knowing what's going on with the link between the environment and the economy. And yet they are both absolutely linked 100%. In most of the problems that we are facing today is exactly because of this economic model, finance model, that unfortunately has disturbed the cleanness, the safety, and the health of the water, the air, and the soil. So we can keep studying all these situations individually, talk about the technology, the old technology and the new technology, independent of education, independent of the economy, independent of consumption habits of our nation. But actually, I think that is counterproductive, and that we must know that these things are interlinked. Our linear economy, where waste is externality, and that polluter pay principle, even though in most environmental legislation is present, is not implemented. So this is a big problem that we must repair in order to fight all the multiple crises that we are living. And maybe we have to adopt all values that were there at the beginning of our civilizations, and new values that are coming so evident. So cooperation, solidarity, sustainability, one planet, one health, and instead of linear, come to circular economy. So climate change is one of the several crises that we are. The planetary crisis is not just climate change, is the pollution, the plastic pollution, is the acidification of oceans, is the disruption of geochemical cycle of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which is causing a lot of eutrophication in our lakes and rendering body of fresh water and not drinkable. And so we have disturbed the climate, and we are seeing extreme weather events, in heat wave forms. In Canada, we have forest fires, we have droughts, and only recently we are starting to measuring how much does these extreme weather events cost, and it's a lot of money, a lot of funds, not only for developed countries, but mostly in developing countries, which they are really affected dramatically by these extreme weather events. So when we see, of course, the causes and the cause, we see that extreme weather events are increasing in frequency, increasing in strength, increasing in destruction, and are rendering vulnerable our basic infrastructure, the roads, the electricity transmission towers, buildings, etc., etc. And so we have to really try to be efficient with the policies and the mechanisms and the solutions that we find in order to tackle not only one of these crises, but the multiple crises. And one of the questions, of course, is, okay, who caused this problem and who's going to pay? Who should pay for all these costs? The costs are always underestimated because the numbers come only from insured losses. So when there is an insurance company and they can say, okay, I reimburse that much, or public institutions that says, well, all this infrastructure costs this, we can have some idea of the cost, but almost unanimously is being published that these costs are underestimated. The real costs are much, much, much higher. Why? Like, for example, if an infrastructure survives an extreme weather event, the vulnerability just go high, and next, a smaller weather event can bring down certain infrastructures. So there are some numbers thrown there that, for example, the climate crisis is costing 16 million per hour, and so the question of who's going to pay for this is very pertinent. So we heard Yolando, and we heard the news, and we follow CAP, and so the international climate regime rests on the principle that common but differentiated responsibilities. Simply put, this means that those countries which bear most responsibility for causing climate change and which have the greatest resources, meaning the developed countries, should shoulder more of the burden for addressing it. This is equal to polluter pay principle, which I want to repeat, that is enshrined in most of environmental legislations, but very, very seldom implemented. So another question that as parliamentarians we should ask is, while the UN is working on all the mechanisms that Yolando Velasco described, and he did mention the bureaucracy, he did mention that we have to make the difference between what is pledged, what is committed, and what it is finally disbursed. And this is going so slow, as Lawrence pointed out. What we should ask as parliamentarians is locally in our parliaments, in our own finance sector, what are we doing? Is our finance sector assisting to fight the climate and pollution crisis, or is it hindering this progress? And my office has studied a lot of this. So we all get to the conclusion that it's time to decarbonize, because science has said that the cause of this climate change and planet warming is burning fossil fuels. Engineers have developed this technology that exists already, the solar, the wind, the hydro, the biomass. public opinion is more and more, and every year is in favor overwhelmingly. In Canada, I can tell you that is 80% of Canadians that think that action on climate is not enough, action on pollution is not enough, and the government should do more. As I mentioned, the costs are very expensive, and we cannot afford the cost of inaction. And sometimes I heard some politicians saying action is too costly, you know, and the numbers that we are talking about in the trillions, in the billions, is very high. But compare it to what? Compare it to the inaction is much more expensive. It's unaffordable. The reason also because renewable energy is it's progressing at the speed is because it's highly efficient. You know, it's highly efficient in producing electricity. It's highly efficient in producing in transport, and the issue with fossil fuels is that it's so dependent on geopolitics and it's so inefficient because you have to extract it, you have to refine it, you have to transport it, you have to create electricity and then make transmission electricity. At each point, we are losing efficiency. And there are some experts that says out of the potential capacity of electricity production of a barrel of oil, when it gets to being used as electricity, it has lost 2/3 of its efficiency. So some people think that it's an ideology and it's a political wish to keep on going to fight the renewable energy, but it's not that. It's that renewable energy is more efficient, and it's the prices are going down and down, and so therefore it is coming by technological changes that we are in the fourth industrial revolution. At the same time, these fossil fuels industry are reporting record profits. And when we analyze on what they are investing, we see that they are not investing in renewable energies. They are not diversifying their activities. And therefore, again, the question is, who should pay? So, as we heard Yolando, we have to shift from spending on fossil fuels and going into renewable energy. And I can tell that in many developed countries, we give so much subsidies. So if we say we are in a free market, what is the role of these subsidies in this, so-called free market? And if we give those subsidies to renewable energy, and we accelerate the pace, what are the gains? So these are the questions that inside our nations we can ask as parliamentarians. So as I mentioned, we have technology, and this technology needs to be transferred to developed countries. And as Lawrence pointed out perfectly, a lot of the critical minerals are in developed countries, and we cannot afford to have a second colonization type of economy and go and again exploit the minerals, the resources, the non-renewable resources of developing countries without assisting and helping for a better future for themselves, So we have a floor of a new social contract where developing countries needs education, access to democracy, stop corruption, as it has been mentioned, higher education, and decrease inequalities. And this is a floor, access to democracy, access to justice. And at the same time, we have planetary limits. And it's in between this floor and this ceiling where our economy must develop and cannot be linear. It needs to be circular. So in general, what we have to see in our policies, in the legislations that we put, we have to have lenses. And these lenses are that initially we used to have social, economy, and environment as three different sectors that don't overlap. Then with sustainable development, we realized no, they overlap, and they should overlap, and they must overlap as much as possible. And so sustainable development came in the picture. But we have to also move and continue in our awareness of the interaction between the economy and the ecological domain, and see that the economic domain is actually inside our social domain, and the social and economic domain are inside of the planetary limits, the ecological domain. So they are not even equal, but one is inside the other. But even when we will finally get to see that our economy is based on nature, not the other way around, because when you look into the GDP of any nation, you will see that the economy comes from natural resources, biodiversity, and ecological services. So the GDP of a nation depends 80% plus on nature, biodiversity, ecological services. So is the economy depending on the environment and not the other way around? Once we get to that point, we will see that we have done so much damage to our planet, to our environment, that we really need to regenerate. And sustainable development is an inflection point, but it's not the end. We should go into regenerate and bring back some diversity that was lost, some ecological systems and habitats that were lost, and recuperate them. So I wrote a Building Forward Better, a clean and just recovery from the COVID, after the COVID, because we have plenty of time to reflect when the COVID happened. And there are a set of policies and legislation having as lenses what I just presented in order to get to what is desired, a net zero or a low carbon economy. And you will see that the finance sector is central to that. If the finance system doesn't help, doesn't change, all our goals about pollution, about climate, about ocean acidification, about plastic won't stop, because we need to change the way the economic and finance flows work today. So you can find more details in that white paper, but in general, if we talk about legislation, we have to do several things at the same time, and it has to be a whole government approach. We have to work on clean energy infrastructure, and for that we need investment. We need to look into building efficiency with respect to electricity and retrofits in order to adapt or to build resilient infrastructure, and for that we need investment. We need to educate and training, and we need really to see that this education and training is global, and that we cannot be owning some things. We have to show solidarity and cooperation, and teach whoever wants to learn about new ways of building and new interactions with our environment. We need, of course, this climate finance that we've been talking a lot, and we cannot stop research and development, but we need to look into clean research and development. Yes, the solar panels have been developed a lot. They are much cheaper. They use a variety of material. The batteries is the same, and we have to keep going in order to increase efficiency. Just to take on some of the things that we have done in Canada, they are not perfect. Lots of them are frameworks, and we need to implement, but Lawrence talked about carbon pricing. This is very important, having a good carbon pricing. We modernize impact assessment in order to take in consideration climate change. We are putting moratoriums on oil tanker transport. We have this Accountability Act, because accountability is our job as parliamentarians on Canadian net zero emissions 2050. We modernize our Canadian Environmental Protection Act, trying, it's very hard, it's very difficult, but trying to say that plastics needs to be reduced. And we have passed very recently a Sustainable Jobs Act, which is a framework. Right now, we are studying in the Parliament a bill that I propose, that my office proposed, is the Climate Aligned Finance Act. But we have other, and I am looking forward to the Nature Accountability Act, which should reflect the Net Zero Accountability Act 2050. Nature Accountability Act should be protect areas 30% of the highly sensible areas in Canada before 2030. And if I just want to finish and talk about what the Climate Aligned Act does, is that this duty of directors, of banks, of insurance, of pension plans, whatever investor there is, they have to be aligned with our climate commitments. There has to be a duty for directors not to just think about profits, but also to have other lenses. The regulators, every nation have finance sector regulators, and these regulators, they must not only regulate also with respect to who pays the extreme weather events, climate destruction, but also in the future, who should pay and how they should work together with a society in order to build a more sustainable infrastructures. For that, we need specific plans. It cannot be just frameworks. We need detailed plans that are based on science and that are based on technology that exists today. It's not technologies that are going to be developed in 20 years, 30 years. I will give the example of carbon capture and storage that is being used as the technology that will come and allow fossil fuels to keep producing. This is a mistake. Carbon capture and storage has been in development for the last 40 years. It has reached a plateau. So these are things that the bill does. So you can always find more information in my website, and there are several other pieces of opinion pieces or white papers that you can consult. So I will like to now open the floor for questions for me or for Lawrence. If you have, I will be very happy to answer those questions. Maybe Dinah or Dinah or Denise can help me with the questions, or I can start by asking a question to Lawrence. Lawrence, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Yes. So Lawrence, you are so right about that. When the third party intervenes and at each stage the funds doesn't arrive 100% to the ground, to the field, it is very little sometimes, and we understand that there must be admin cost and bureaucracy cost, but what will be acceptable? Can we put a limit on the losses? Like, for example, shouldn't be any loss higher than 10%.
Yeah, thank you very much. Usually, preference of many of these LDCs, including the countries in Africa, is that at least out of the funds approved or the climate finance approved to a country, at least 70%, 60 to 70% should reach the country, and it should reach the country. But in most cases, you find instead 30% is reaching the country. Much of it is going to hardware and professional fees, flights, and so on. So you find really to address that vulnerability on a paper, even if you go to European Union, even if you go to this green, for example, a lot of money has come to Uganda, but what has reached the ground is very little, because this money either came through the UN agencies, which actually used it almost in their.
Yes, so you are right. So the next COP in Baku, it's going to focus on finance. And shouldn't parliamentarians, talk about this and ask from the very beginning that
Hello?
when they...
Hello?
Hello?
Do you hear
Are
me?
you...
Yes.
Yes, I hear. Yes, I hear you.
Yes, I was saying you find the funds are coming through some of these UN agencies. As a result, there are a lot of consultancy, a lot of professional fees, and then the hardware. So what really goes on the ground is very little. Right now, there are many mothers and children under 5 who are suffering because of indoor air pollution. But if you see the amount of money that would be required to give them solar lamps instead of using kerosene, the amount of money that should be used to promote clean cooking would be really very small. But why? What is reaching the ground is so little. That's why you see the recycling mortality of mothers and children under 5 of indoor air pollution, because they are cooking using firewood and charcoal in poorly ventilated kitchen, and then for lighting they are using kerosene. So these are things that can be avoided if 60 or 70% of the money can go direct to promote clean cooking in the communities. Thank you.
And do you think that that limit, of let's say 30% on all the rest, should be imposed by the grantor, the UN, or should it be look inside in the nation?
We really don't know why. We know that there is Green Climate Fund guidebook, but in most cases, preference is given to UN entities, and yet sometimes, for the case of Uganda, for example, we already have 3 nationally designated entities that can receive the funds direct, but preference is always given for this money to go through a third party. As a result, there are a lot of expenditures on the way. What reaches the ground, even if you go to the communities, you don't see the impact. And yet it could be a very small problem of floods that would have been corrected immediately if that money really came to the community or the grassroots. So the problem is not in the NDA. The problem is the procedure used by this Green Climate Fund Adaptation Fund to send the money through maybe some of these UN agencies instead of going directly to the country, the NDA. And then if such a thing happens that it should go through the UN agencies or another body before it reaches the country, the position of the countries is that 60 or 70% should reach the ground. They can maintain the 30 or 40%.
Okay, I have a question here. It says, I think it's for me. It says, you mentioned the needed paradigm shift to address the climate crisis. We from civil society call it system change to address climate change. What role do you think parliamentarians can play in this paradigm shift? Maybe you can also help me, Lawrence, answering this question. I think that parliamentarians have a big role to play in starting with raising awareness. I think that it's responsibility of the parliamentarians to educate themselves. I see the ones that are around me in this network, and I really, really so proud of all of them that they, despite of coming from different professional horizons, they have decided to teach themselves, learn more about what is the situation and the solutions that are available to us. So raising awareness, public awareness, asking for accountability. The nation has some goals, some commitments, as Yolando explained. There are pledges, there are commitments, and there are disbursements. And so at each step, I think parliamentarians has to be there to say, well, we pledge this. When are we committing? Where we committed this? When we are disbursing? And so this is very important. Let me tell you that in general, what I think is that today, given the globalization, the world in which we live, where we import and export things from one side of the planet to another side of the planet, we are interconnected right now. I don't know where are you sitting, but I know you are from everywhere in the planet. But we can still communicate, you know. And so given all of that, the reason because poverty still exists and people are still needing food is not because there is lack of food. Have never been more food than today. It is because there is lack of political will to push for more of solidarity and cooperation and reducing inequality. So I think the role of parliamentarian is good, but at the same time, I also want to say that these parliamentarians, they are elected. So they come from the choice of civil society. Do you want to add anything to that, Lawrence?
I can add little. I had already talked about the roles of members of parliament, that members of parliament play a big role in influencing climate financing, but also the management of the funds in the country. One area which is very important is the area of legislation. You cannot really be looking for funds around the world if you don't have the laws that would provide for you a basis for negotiations for those funds in country. So legislation is very important. And also the first money to address climate change challenges must come from our budget. And it is only legislators who can allocate or appropriate that money. And then the second money can come from other funds. If in a country you have not prioritized that money, there is no way a foreign body will say, we are giving you money to address challenge. So address the challenge. So members of parliament are very important to see that the first money to address the problem must come from the budget. Then number 3 is the issue of ensuring accountability, oversight and accountability. Once the money has come, it is the same members of parliament who should play the oversight and accountability to see that the money has been put to right use to address the NDC or the priorities of that country. And then the issue of representation. There are things that need advocacy. If communities are suffering from floods, it is the members of parliament who are approached first, and then as a result, they can bring it on the floor of parliament, and then it translates into budget and implementation. So representation of the voices of the voiceless, but also advocacy to address that problem. And then the issue of capacity building. I think it is very important. It is a role also members of parliament can play. And then stakeholders engagement. There are many stakeholders in this: government, civil society, academia, private sector. All these people need to be brought together so that we can find a way forward, a common position. So that is one area where members of parliament can help in stakeholder engagement. And then I talked about international cooperation. We need international cooperation so that if we are talking about carbon pricing, the challenges may not be in Uganda. The challenge may be to discuss with some people, buyers in Europe, in America, in Canada, and so on. So we need that kind of international cooperation. There are things that can be done at the negotiating table, like during the UNFCCC negotiations, but there in the negotiation, technical people alone from the ministries may not manage. It sometimes requires some political backing, and that backing can only come from members of parliament or the politicians of that country. Then monitoring and evaluation of the activities, and then the issue of coordination. In country, you will find in many governments, coordination between one ministry and the other is a challenge, and yet climate change is manifesting itself in many ways, and the ministries that are concerned, like for example in Uganda, much as the focal ministry is Ministry of Water and Environment, but you will find that there are climate change related issues that are coming from Ministry of Works and Transport. There are climate change related issues that are coming from Ministry of Tourism or Industries, Trade, Health. There are issues to do with climate change and health. So to bring all these people together, and you know ministries, how they work, sometimes coordination is a challenge. So it is this committee of parliament, for example, where members of parliament are, to bring all these bodies together. Like, for example, we are working on climate change, it would be very easy. Finally, the issue of awareness raising. You can have media engagement, radio talk shows, community engagement. All those are roles members of parliament can play.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. I think you were cut. But let me give the floor to Honorable Abduli from Gambia, who wants to share some some ideas. Go ahead, Honorable Abduli.
Thank you so much, Honorable Moderator. Am I audible, Senator
Yes.
Rosa?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. It's quite an honor to be part of this wonderful setup. It's always refreshing to see my fellow parliamentarians and colleagues. I am the country focal person for Parliamentarians Call for Social Free Future in the Republic of the Gambia, West Africa. And I'll first of all like to thank all the panelists present and the initiation of this wonderful meeting. We've gathered a lot from all the inputs you people have put in, especially Honorable Rosa. You've been able to give us a holistic perspective on a global scale, I would say, to look at things in a very positive direction, especially when you made mention of the importance of having global actors to make sure unison is brought forward in propelling our climatic global goals, because we cannot work in isolation, and that to be able to cope the situation, it needs a global action, and we can only do that if we are able to synchronize efforts and galvanize the relevant ideologies behind what we need to propel us forward. Honorable Rollins has said it all, I would say, speaking from an African perspective. We are always far behind on so many issues, and it's really taking a toll on us. He made mention that we are one of the, if not, we hardly emit at all, basically, with all African countries combined together, basically. So we cannot really share the burden from actors who are, emitting more than us, basically. So then there has to be a parameter that can be set with regards to what role Africa has to play in all this process, because Africa's case is a very special one, because we are not emitting at all, and we are vulnerable. We have the resources, but we cannot tap into our resources based on expertise, based on so many things, because we are third world, most of us are third world countries. So Honorable Lawrence made something very, very important that ignited the need for me to at least chip in. He made mention of the idea of climate finance and the accessibility of funding, which is really deterring us from being able to execute or make the relevant changes or feasible, tangible changes that are needed in order for us to be able to contribute towards the climatic, goals. If you take Gambia, for example, where I'm coming from, for example, in the city of Banjul, where I'm a representative. We are just a meter above sea level. We are fighting land degradation. We propelling conservation. Even just next month, I'm invited in Bonn, Germany, to make a presentation on the Tanbi wetlands, which is a Ramsar Convention. We're fighting tooth and nail, but the problem is the process is so rigorous when it comes to tapping finance. And I could vividly remember just a couple of years ago, part of the Paris agreements, I think there was a global pledge of over $100 billion, I would say, for loss and damage, for example, climate finance. And I think I don't think even 25 billion of that has been spent, basically. And these were promises, and everyone came out of that particular meeting, being elated, and there was confidence, there was hope that finally, at least funding will be available, be able to help in mitigation, in loss and damage, and other climate-related initiatives. But since then, I think if you look at youth bodies, for example, youth groups that are climate-related, are losing hope in the political realm when it comes to promises, among other things. And it's taking a toll on us, for example. In the Gambia, recently, there was a group even called Banjul that had to protest with regards to issues of this climatic changes, because they're saying that the funds are not forthcoming. Though Parliament, we do our level best every year. We make sure we allocate certain funding to the Ministry of Environment, who have to filter it down. But just a few days ago, we had the National Climate Conference, whereby a representative from government from the horse's mouth. She said that even at government level, most of these funds are channeled through UN agencies. And in order to tap funding from these UN agencies, the criteria are so rigorous. And, most of these funds even sometimes cannot make it. They cannot, live up to the requirements to be able to, tap into those fundings. And these are deterrents from us moving forward. So this was a contribution I felt was very important to put through. And I would like both you, Honorable Rosa, and also Honorable Lawrence, to shed light on these particular areas. And also, how can we as parliamentarians galvanize ourselves together in making sure we come up with a position paper or whatever it might be in order to make sure that the channeling process maybe can be changed to a more easier way to access funds, or maybe to see what we could do at the UN level, at least to ease some of these, bureaucracies that are attached with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Abduli. This was a very pertinent intervention, and thank you so much for sharing the situation in your country and your views. Absolutely agree that we must influence. As we heard from Yolando, things are still in the progress of being developed. So I think it is our responsibility as this network to put together an opinion and recommendations how these process of quantitative and qualitative and delivering mechanisms should be done. Because once they are in place, then we won't be able to modify them. If we raise awareness at this point, I think that we have more chances of being more efficient in the process of delivering. And that's what I was saying, what is acceptable? We all know that some administrations and some costs are associated, but I completely agree that most of the funds must be delivered in the field. But also the other point is about the type of mechanism, whether it's a grant or whether it's a loan. And if it's a loan, the access and the rates of the interest, we need to really raise and elevate the demands from the developing countries. Lawrence, I don't know if you want to add something. We are 2 minutes away of ending the seminar. I find it very constructive.
I think on that I have no comment. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay. Dear colleagues, dear guests, thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers, to our network. They are behind. We don't see them, but this was brought thanks to them and their hard work. Thank you to each of them. If there is nothing else, I will leave you with your activities, wishing you success and wishing us also success, and spread the word. We need to increase the number of parliamentarians in our network. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.